So we last left off building applications with WT forms and securing our applications with CSRF protection. It's now time to deploy our applications to Heroku. So I'm starting with that same users messages forms folder. I'm just going to make a copy of that and we'll call that users messages Heroku. I'll go back into that folder and let's make a new virtual environment. We'll call that users messages Heroku. And you can use another platform to deploy this application. Heroku, I just think, is one of the much easier ones, and that'll really get you up and running quickly with deploying an application. It's very procedural, but you just have to follow these steps to a T, or else things aren't going to work. So let's install our dependencies. We're going to install Flask. We can install IPython if we need to debug things later on, Flask modus to override the method, Flask SQL alchemy as our ORM, Psycho PG2, which I think I spelled correctly this time, Flask WTF, Flask migrate, and Flask script. And once again, if we miss one, that's okay. We can always install it at a later point in time. So we'll give that a second to install. And when we're deploying our application to Heroku, we're going to have to be really mindful about making sure that our application has its own production database as well. So we're going to see in a little bit how to create that. So we'll wait for these dependencies to load. And the next thing that we're going to want to do is make some pretty important files for deploying our application to Heroku. One of those is a file called requirements.txt. And requirements.txt is going to list all of the dependencies for Heroku to install. But there's one more dependency that I forgot, and that is Gunicorn or Gunicorn. And this is an essential server that is production ready and not just for development. So we're not going to use the Flask development server, we're going to use Gunicorn. So let's install Gunicorn. And once we have this installed, we can then actually add that to our requirements.txt. Requirements.txt, once again, is just a file that's going to list all of our dependencies. That's what Heroku expects, so that it knows how to install all those dependencies for our production server. Great. The way to get all of our dependencies into our requirements.txt file is to redirect them from a command called Pip Freeze. If we take a look at Pip Freeze, it's going to print out all of the dependencies and the versions that we have. So what we're going to do is use that Pip Freeze command, but redirect it to a file called requirements.txt. If we take a quick look at requirements.txt, we can see it has all of those dependencies. This is an essential file that you need. We're also going to make two more files that Heroku needs to know about. One of them is going to be a proc file, and this is the command that Heroku needs to start the server. We have to place this in a file called a proc file that starts with a capital P and doesn't have any extension. So if we want, we can do this directly from the terminal. What we're going to do is type in echo web : Gunicorn, let me make sure I spell that right, app : app into proc file. Now you could make a proc file, but we're just going to do this all from the terminal. So if we take a look at the proc file using the cat command, we should see that's what it expects. So for the web application that we're doing, we're going to use the Gunicorn command to start our application from a file called app.py. Now to make sure we're getting the right version of Python, let's type in Python right now. And we can see that we're using Python 3.6. So I'm going to quit out of this and I'm going to type in echo Python -3.6.0 into runtime.txt. So we want to make sure the same version that we're using locally for Python is what we use in deployment. Now the way to get our code to Heroku is to use Git to push that code there. So we got to make sure that I'm going to initialize some Git application. So we're going to git init. If you're not too comfortable with Git, take a look at some of the curriculum we have about getting started with it. You're going to need to understand how Git works to deploy this code to Heroku. To make sure that you've installed Heroku successfully, you can type in brew install Heroku. If you've already installed it, you should be able to just type in Heroku, and you should see a whole bunch of commands right here. The first thing that you want to do is make sure that you create an account on Heroku.com. And once you've set up all that information and validated your email, you can type in Heroku login. So we're going to do this all from the command line. I'm going to enter the credentials that I have. I'll put in my password as well, and it'll see in a second if we're logged in. There we go. That looks good. Once we've logged in, we need to create an application. Now, ideally, you want to give your application a name, hopefully one that isn't taken. We can call this users messages Heroku ES. Those are just my initials. And if that name doesn't exist yet, we should be able to create that application. You can see right here, it actually gives us the URL for our application, as well as a repository to push our code to. That's a great start. If we want to make sure that we have that remote, we can type in git remote -v, and we can see that looks like we have a remote by the name of Heroku. So to send our code to Heroku, we're going to git push Heroku master. But first, we want to make sure that we add all the code we have. We'll commit with a message saying ready to deploy. And then we'll push our code to Heroku from the branch that we're on, which is master, git push Heroku master. Now this is going to take a little bit of time, but what we're going to do is tell this Heroku server about a Python app. The latest version is Python 3.6.2. We're using 3.6, which is unsupported. So we recommend upgrading to a specified version. So maybe in a future commit, we'll change that runtime txt to be 3.6.2 instead of 3.6.0. That'll be important. And remember, anytime that you want to make new changes to your application, you need to once again change that file, add it, and commit it, and then send an updated version. So let's actually do that to make sure that Heroku supports that version that we have. We're almost done with this process. It's going to tell us that it's compressing, and then we should have some file that's up and running. So before we even take a look at this application, we're going to change two things. We're first going to go back into Sublime, and we're going to change that runtime txt to 3.6.2 to make sure that that's the version that Heroku supports. We're also going to do one more thing here, and that is type in Heroku ps scale web equals 1. And let's make sure that we actually spell Heroku correctly. That would be a lot better. Heroku ps scale web equals 1. And what this is going to do is allocate what's called a worker, one process for Heroku, to run our web application. Just make sure that that's up and running. The next thing we want to do is once again add, we're going to commit. We're going to say changing from Python 3.6.0 to 3.6.2. How do we get our code to Heroku? Once again, git push Heroku master. So we'll give that a second. We'll go start that application once it's done. But what we're going to do is actually open up another tab that's going to be very useful to see what the Heroku logs look like. When you debug an application, you always want to keep something like Heroku Logs open. We're going to add the -t just to get the tailing part of the log so that any time that something changes, we can see what happens. So it started up by eshopik@gmail.com. That's great. We can see right here, as things happen, we're actually going to see these logs change. And as we make requests, we're going to see those logs change as well. So let's give that a second. And if you notice here at the very top, let's make sure that we have that version of Python supported. Great. Removing 3.6.0, installing 3.6.2, no error messages or warnings there. And here, we can actually see, if we want to go to our application, this is the URL right here that it's been deployed to. We can also type in Heroku open. So I'm going to type in Heroku open. And if we take a look at what we have right now, we immediately get an internal server error. That's not good. Well, how could we debug this? Let's go back to the logs. Let's make this a little bit smaller and see if you can figure out what the issue is. A secret key is required to use CSRF. We've seen that before. You can see exception, there's an error. If we take a look down here, you can actually see that key error. Well, the problem here is that we're trying to use CSRF protection, but Heroku doesn't know about that environment variable. It's only inside of our post-activate script. So what we're going to do is create an environment variable for Heroku. We're going to do that by typing Heroku config :set secret key to be something like hi, or let's make something a little bit longer like shh. So we're setting a secret key and restarting it. If we take a look right here, set secret key config variable, starting the process again. Let's go back to the browser and let's see what we get. We'll give that a second and we're back to another internal server error. That's okay. How do we debug this? Back in the terminal. Let's see what's going on here. SQL Alchemy exception operational error could not connect to server. Connection refused. Is the server running on localhost? Well, that's a problem. Localhost is going to be where we run things locally, but we haven't configured a database for Heroku to connect to. So what we need to do is add a Postgres database for production. And we're going to do that using Heroku add-ons :create Heroku PostgreSQL :hobby-dev. And that's just going to give us a free, very, very small Postgres database that right now is empty. But if we take a look at our environment variables, we now see that there is a database URL. And this is what we're going to use to connect to in production. So how could we figure out what to connect to in production? Let's make another environment variable, config:set, and we'll call that env. And let's assign that to the string production. And what we're going to do is a little bit of conditional logic inside of our app.py. So we'll go back to Sublime. Let's open this up. And in our app.py, we don't want to connect to this database right here. We want a little bit of conditional logic. So we could say if os.environ.get env is production, well, let's go change a couple things. We'll want to make sure that debug is false. We don't want people seeing a stack trace. And we're going to configure our SQL Alchemy database URI to be os.environ.get database URL. So what is os.environ on Heroku? It refers to these environment variables that we've set up. On Heroku, os.environ includes these variables right here. So what we can say is if it's production, use these ones. Otherwise, go ahead and configure like we would normally. Set up all this logic right here. You can see it's a bit messy that we have all this conditional logic inside of our app.py. So in a little bit, we'll see how to configure that using some object-oriented programming using concepts like inheritance and polymorphism. If we see right here, we've configured debug to be false. Let's go back inside here and configure debug to be true. And all the way down in our application, we can take out this debug right here. We can save that, and that looks better. Now we've made some changes to our app.py. So what do we need to make sure that we do? Git add dot, git commit -m. We'll say adding conditional logic to connect to correct DB in production. We've also changed some other things, but I think that's the big one. Git push Heroku master. Once again, we'll give that a second. And how do we see what it looks like to make sure that we're connecting to the right thing? Well, we got to go back here to our Heroku logs. I'm going to press Command K to clear that. And hopefully when we go back to this page, we should have a production database. There's still one little thing that we might be missing with this production application. Let's go back and take a look. We can see we're starting the process up again. Let's go back to the browser. Let's go see what it looks like. We'll refresh this page. And we get another internal server error. That's okay. We're making progress. Well, it says a secret key is required to use CSRF. So what did we forget to do with a secret key is required to use CSRF? Well, let's go back to our application. And it looks like we just forgot to add app.config secret key up here as well. And since that's not necessary, we can actually put that everywhere. We want to make sure that we have a secret key in production and in development. So that was a little mishap on my part. Let's go back here once again, git add dot, git commit -m, making sure secret key is available in dev and production. And we'll git push Heroku master. You may find yourself after making a lot of these small commits wanting to squash that or put that into one commit because you will be making changes pretty frequently to your Heroku application, and that's okay. So we'll make sure we install those requirements. Looks like we have those already, so this should be a little bit faster. We'll give that a second to deploy. And once that's deployed, we'll go back to our Heroku logs, Command K to clear this, and let's see if we still get that error. Let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh the page. And we're still getting another 500. Well, let's go see why that is. And this is good. We're getting a different error this time. Nothing wrong with getting a bunch of 500 errors as long as the error message is changing and you're making some progress. Well, let's see what's here. SQL Alchemy exception programming error relation users did not exist. What does that mean? Well, it means that in our production database, we don't actually have a table called users. How come we don't have a table called users? Well, we've set up a production database, but our production database doesn't actually have any tables. We can see what that looks like if we want by typing in Heroku PG:PSQL. What this is going to do is connect us to our production database. If we take a look, /DT, there are no tables there. Well, that's probably why we're getting a problem when we try to select all of our users. So I'll /Q. And what we need to do is take any changes that we've made to our schema and run them on Heroku. Well, what tool do we have to manage changes to our schema? We have our migrations. So what we're going to tell Heroku to do is to run a command in the terminal on our production server called python manage py db upgrade. We've already sent a folder with our migrations to Heroku, so we're going to tell Heroku right now to take those changes and to run them in production. We can see right here we're running the upgrade for adding a users table, adding a messages table. Let's go back here. We can see that the process started up again. Let's go back to the browser and refresh the page. And there we go, we're deployed. We can add a new user. Let's try to add Ellie. That looks good. We still have our validations. Let's add Shopik. That looks great. We can edit this user. Looks like we're in business. We can delete this user and we have some CRUD on our users. So far, so good. And if we take a look at our logs, we can see all these requests. We have posts, we have gets that are coming in. We even have deletes that are overriding the method. Our application is live in production. That's fantastic. But there's one more thing that we might want to change. What we're going to do here is make a new file called config.py. And the purpose of config.py is to help us remove some of this conditional logic. It's not too bad right now, but it's going to become pretty unmanageable as we start having more environment variables and even different environments. Maybe we want a staging and a production and a testing and a development or a local one. So we're going to try to move all this logic to our config.py. So inside of our config.py, we're just going to import OS. And we're going to make a class called config. And inside of here, we're going to set a couple properties. We're going to take out this whole app.config. And what we're going to say is that any configuration should have a secret key. Any configuration should have a property called debug. And by default, let's say that any configuration is going to have a SQL Alchemy database URI. These are going to be the default settings for any environment that we're in. What we can do here is now subclass config by making something called production config. We'll say that's going to inherit from config, but let's overwrite something like our SQL Alchemy database URI. And let's go overwrite our debug. And let's go, why not add the track modifications as well. So what have we done right here? What we've set up is a class called production config, and it's going to inherit from config. But by default, any application that we run is going to start with these things. Because when we're developing locally, this is all the stuff that we want. And in production, these are really the only things that we want to change. So we could make this verbose, but we're going to keep it pretty simple here. I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to go back to my app.py. And now, how do I configure this application? Well, what's nice is we can add a little bit of logic that says if os.environ.getEnv is production, if we've set up some environment variable that tells us that we're in production, we are going to configure our application from an object. And that is going to be from the config file and from the class called production config. Otherwise, we're going to configure from an object called config, but we didn't make a class for development. So let's go back here and we'll make a class for development config that's going to inherit from config as well. And here, maybe we'll want to set something like this default database URI. We could pass inside of here. It really doesn't make too much of a difference, but we want to make sure that we have a development configuration with this specific database right here. We'll just use user messages, keep it simple. So what we're going to do is add config.development config. So instead of adding all that conditional logic inside of here, we've set up a specific configuration file to handle our application. How do we make sure this is working on Heroku? Well, let's go back to the terminal. We're going to git add, git commit, -m, refactoring logic to a config.py file. And let's git push Heroku master. And let's see what this application looks like. But instead of combining a whole bunch of conditional logic in our app.py, we've configured our application from an object. That config right here refers to the file. And inside of this config, we have a class called production config right here. It inherits from the config class, which starts with some things that we might want in all the places. As you have multiple environments like staging and testing, you might want to add other environment variables or information right here. It'll be a very useful way to isolate those different things. We're using inheritance right here, and that idea of many different kinds of versions or polymorphism to set some initial information and potentially change that as we want. So let's head back to the terminal. Let's type in Heroku open. Let's take a look at our application. And it looks like we're still in good shape. Let's add Eli Shopik. Let's go save that. Let's see all the messages. Let's add a new message. We'll say, hello, Heroku. We can add that message. We can edit that message. And it looks like we have an application with a URL that you can now send to anybody. So if you understand how to deploy this application to Heroku, you now have a URL that can be shared with other people, and your application is live. You can go and buy a domain that looks a lot better than this one right here, and just point that to be this application right here. So how do we do that? Once again, it's very procedural, and you can read a lot of that in the curriculum, but it involved a couple essential files, a runtime.txt, a requirements.txt, and a proc file to make sure that we set everything up. We also want to make sure that we've done things like Heroku PS scale, set our config variables. The way to do this is just to do it a couple times and really master getting used to deploying your applications to production. As you can see, I still haven't implemented the message forms with CSRF protection. I'm leaving that one up to you, but make sure you have that done and get your application deployed to Heroku, and I'll see you in the next screencast.